Everyone, we've been having a look at the question answers of History Chapter 1, the French Revolution. So let's continue. What circumstances led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte? The fall of Jacobians. We've already seen that in the last lesson we saw that Maximilian Robespierre, the leader of the Jacobians, was finally guillotined by his own people. So the fall of Jacobians led to the rise of the wealthier middle classes to gain power. So see, the first time when the revolution broke out, when people of the Third Estate walked out of the Estates General and they formed a National Assembly after taking a tennis court oath, those were people who belonged to the Third Estate, but they were the rich, educated people, alright? After those came the Jacobians, who also belonged to the Third Estate, but they were people with more modest means. Now, after the fall of the Jacobians, again people of the Third Estate come up, but this is the middle class. They form a new constitution which denied vote to non-propertied sections of the society. It had, now see, once again, non-propertied sections of society means in the middle, in this new government which is then formed by the middle class of the Third Estate, they don't give voting rights to people who don't have property. It had 2 elected legislature and 5 members of directory and executive. However, directors often clashed with legislature. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. So, once again from the top, first there used to be the Estates General. Then the National Assembly, then convention by the Jacobians, then directory by the middle class, and finally 5th Napoleon Bonaparte. Now this is the political history we've seen so far. Now we'll have a look at the social, what was happening in the social scenario also, both socio-political. Name one famous women's club. The Society of Revolutionaries and Republicans, Women was the most famous women's club. Their demand was that women should enjoy the same political rights as men. They demanded the right to vote and to be elected to the assembly and hold political office. Today, our country as a democracy, we give our women these rights. They can vote and they can also stand for elections. Did women really have a revolution? So the whole question is, women are standing up for themselves, but did they really have a revolution? Now, what you see in history is there is no clear answer like no or yes, but as such, for this question, we will say they probably did not really have a revolution as other people of the society because women did not get the right to vote. So, like you see, I have done a correction. They did not get any political rights in 1789 or even after that. They got it much later in 1946, and thus we can't really say they have a revolution because a revolution won't really be complete if you really have some power in your hands. So they were passive participants in the events and they brought many changes in the French society. So they were passive participants because they were not politically active. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. But women kept pressurizing the government to give them certain rights. Women from the Third Estate were working women like housemaid, vegetable fruit sellers and laundresses. They did not have education rights and had low wages than men. Most revolutionary club of women came up and demanded these rights. However, we see that in the early years of a revolutionary government, some laws like schooling was made compulsory for all girls, marriage was made legal, divorce, and anyone could then apply for divorce. This means that a marriage was no longer something written down as something only being done by a man, but also something being done by a woman where she could apply for divorce. Women started getting training for jobs and they became artists and they began to run small businesses. However, so all of this happened during the time of the National Assembly. Then came the Reign of Terror, right? So the Reign of Terror issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. The Reign of Terror was an absolute terror for most of the people. Many women were arrested and executed or killed. The fight for the vote was carried out, or fight for voting rights was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th century. They finally got voting rights in 1946, which was almost after 200 years. Discuss the Declaration of Rights of Woman and Citizen. Remember earlier, we've had a look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which was drafted by the National Assembly. Well, women realized they're not given enough rights, and that declaration always said that man has so and so rights. So finally, one woman, Olympe de Gouges, she writes the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen. In this she wrote, so these rights were introduced by Olympe de Gouges, and in this she writes, woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. The goal of all political associations is the preservation of the natural rights of woman and man. These are liberty, property, security, and above all, resistance to oppression. Let's have a look at the earlier point. In the Declaration of Man, it was written, man is born free and remains equal. But the Women Declaration says, women is born free and remains equal, just like a man. Equal and in rights. The second says, preservation of natural rights of woman and man. They both have fundamental rights. But what did the Declaration of Man say? That the preservation of natural rights should only be of man, and so and so rights are only given to man. Then the source of all sovereignty resides in the nation, which is nothing but the union of women and men, or women and men. So here they're trying to say that your country is not just comprising of men who have all the power, but women also. The law should be the expression of the general will, all female representatives in its formulation. It should be the same for all female and male citizens, as they are equally entitled to all honors and public employment, according to their abilities and without any other distinction than that of their talents. So here, very interestingly, it says women are not demanding for anything extra. They are saying that give us the equal rights as man, and if a woman is ever caught doing something wrong against the law, she will also be punished just like a man would. It's very important to understand this is also the modern idea of, or this is also the idea of feminism. So if someone out there ever tells you that women who believe in feminism hate men, they don't. They don't hate men. What they want is equal rights and equal opportunities, as men have been given throughout so many years, as we see in history. And what they are against is a patriarchal society. A patriarchal society is where there is a male head of the household, which is further followed by patrilineal and patrilocal, where importance is given to the lineage of the man. People reside in the house, a married couple would reside in the house of a man, and so on and so forth. No woman is an exception. She is accused, arrested, and detained by the law, just like a man. So women and men both should agree to this law also. Now, slaves. Discuss the rise of slaves. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. You'll also notice that these four are cash crops, which means they get a lot of money. By the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on plantations. So the thing was, Europeans didn't want to go all the way to the Caribbeans and work on these plantations. So who's going to work? The slaves. So this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, America and Africa. America is where the plantation is. Africa is from where the slaves will come. And Europeans are the people who own the plantations, and then they will go to Africa, take the slaves from there and put the slaves in America and also control the slaves and make them work in the plantations. This began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the port of Bordeaux on Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Slaves were branded and shackled, which means, like a mark was put on them, a hot metals mark, and they were tied up, shackled, chained, and they were packed tightly into ships for 3 months long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. The exploitation of slaves made it possible to meet the growing demands in European markets. Ports like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. When was slavery abolished? The criticism of slavery started in 18th century. National Assembly had long debates about the ban on slaves, but it did not pass any laws fearing opposition by the businessmen whose income depended on the slave trade. The convention passed the ban of slavery in 1794. This convention is the one led by the Jacobians in French overseas possessions. However, when Napoleon came to power, he reintroduced slavery in 1754. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. So all the plantation owners knew that for the economic interests, it was okay to slave another person and force them to work, make them a slave. However, slavery was finally abolished in 1848. How did the abolition of censorship affect France? Now, abolition of censorship, don't get confused as to what this means. Censorship, so see, today in democracy we have freedom of press, right? And freedom to write books and have movies and songs and theatre, and they can be ideas against the government also. However, once in a while we see political problems where the government is not very tolerant. But in a democracy, it has to allow dissent. Anyway, censorship means when there is no freedom of press. To keep things easy, no freedom of newspapers, they all have to listen to the government, and if dare anyone writes anything against the government, criticizes the government, then they are punished. So censorship was abolished in France. Let's see how it affected the country. In 1789, the new law was passed, which was the abolition of censorship. Earlier when there was censorship, all the books, papers, newspapers and plays could only be published or performed after they had been approved by the king. However, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. This made newspapers, books, pamphlets, etc. flood the towns of France and later the countryside. This made opposing views of the events be printed and discussed by public. So once there was free circulation of opinions, people could read different ideas and make up their minds of what they really wanted. Many plays, songs, etc. attracted people to grasp and identify with ideas or justice or liberty, whereas texts were also read by educated people. So remember, we've come across the name of these philosophers, Montesquieu, John Locke, Rousseau. How did the ideas spread? The ideas spread because censorship had been abolished. What changes did Napoleon introduce as an emperor? In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as the Emperor of France. Now, the irony of this whole French Revolution is it starts in order to remove the king from power, but it ends by a person who comes to power and declares himself the king. He started conquering neighboring European countries and dispossessing dynasties, and he created kingdoms where he could place his family also. However, he was quite revolutionary as far as his laws were concerned. Many reforms he did. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. So weights and measures and decimal system, everything was made uniform by him. Many saw him as the modernizer of Europe, and many saw him as a liberator who will bring freedom. Because it's a new kind of freedom. It's not the court culture. It was the court culture. He was the king, but yet he gives people property rights, individual property rights, all right? Not the ones of the church. Here, people could individually own private property and so on. But soon the Napoleonic army came to be viewed as an invading force, and other countries of Europe did not like him because they realized that he's invading their countries and placing his family there. So these other European countries finally got together and defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo. His measures of liberty and modern laws had a long impact on people long after Napoleon had left. These are just a few extra questions which will revolve around similar questions like we've done earlier. Why was Olympe de Gouges an important lady? Olympe de Gouges was an important political woman because she protested against the constitution of men and citizens as they excluded women from basic rights that each human being was entitled to. We've seen this earlier. She wrote a Declaration of Rights of Women and Citizen. She criticized the Jacobian government for closing down women's clubs. And finally, what happens if you ever raised your voice against the Jacobian? You were put on trial, but that trial was quite fake because you could never win if the Jacobians didn't like you. So she was tried by the convention and she was executed. Now, the important question. Did France, the country as a whole, did the country really have a revolution? Very interesting answer. The French Revolution of 1789 is seen as an example of rebellion against tyranny of the Ancien regime. The Ancien regime means the ancient regime. Under Louis XVI, it saw the Third Estate take effective steps and establish the National Assembly. Constitutional monarchy was adopted and the three organs of government were made separate after people got inspired from ideas of Locke, Rousseau and Montesquieu. However, so we've seen the changes that have happened, however, the poor and uneducated people of France were dissatisfied and formed a group of Jacobians, which was led by Maximilien Robespierre. They formed the convention and abolished monarchy because they killed the king. Their depression tactics, their repressive taxes, gave their rule the name Reign of Terror. So we cannot ignore the fact that the French Revolution did not really establish a very modern democracy as we believe democracy to be, and women also had to fight for the next 200 years for their political rights. But it must be appreciated that at a time when all countries were ruled by monarchs, France was able to overthrow the absolute monarch and even grant something like as important as compulsory education for all women. Thank you.